Okay. All right. Kill all the lawyers. Okay, so you've heard it lots of times, and you may have seen it on coffee mugs, and you may have seen it on T-shirts, and you may have even seen it on a billboard. And the trouble is that a lot of people who quote this line are not sure whether it's from Shakespeare, or what play it's from, or what character says it, or what Shakespeare really meant by this term. So let's look into that, and let's start with the play that it comes from, and it's from Henry VI, Part 2, which is part of a tetralogy of 4 plays that cover English history from towards the end of the 100 Years' War to the end of the Wars of the Roses. And this includes the 3 parts of Henry VI and the play Richard III. And the line actually comes from Act 4 of Henry VI, Part 2, which deals with the Jack Cade Rebellion of 1450. And let me give you a little historical context on that. Now, the 100 Years' War actually lasted more than 100 years, from 1337 to 1453. And this was about England's attempt to take over France, because the English kings thought that they had a legitimate claim to the throne of France. And so that war lasted a long time. Eventually, England lost it, although they had some triumphs in between. The Jack Cade Rebellions, 1450, that's near the end of the 100 Years' War. And then not long after that, the Wars of the Roses started, which were a civil war in which different factions were fighting over the crown of England. And the picture we have on the right here is a depiction of Shakespeare's version of how the two sides chose up their symbols, and one side, the Yorks, chose the white rose, and the Lancasters chose the red rose, and that's why it was called the War of the Roses. Now, one personage that seems to loom over the Henry VI plays, even though he's dead, is Henry V, who was considered one of the great English kings, the one who actually did become King of France for a while, and was called the Star of England in Shakespeare's play Henry V. And that was largely because of his famous victory over the French at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Now, his son, Henry VI, was a very different personality. Because of Henry V's early death, Henry VI was crowned king at age 9 months. And he was very different from his father. Bookish, pious, introverted. He had bouts of mental illness. This passage here from Henry VI, Part 2, I think sums him up very well. He said, "Was ever king that joyed an earthly throne and could command no more content than I? No sooner was I crept out of my cradle, but I was made a king at 9 months old. Was never subject long to be a king, as I do long and wish to be a subject." And so he did not feel that he was exactly made for the job, and England lost its territories in France during his reign. Now, I've taught the Henry VI plays in my Shakespeare and the Law course, and a lot of the students complain about it's hard to keep track of all the characters. So I'm going to make it easy for you. And here's what I tell my students. This may remind you of Marty's talk about all the different Aubreys. But this is the key to the characters' names in the Henry VI plays. All the men are named Richard or Henry or Edward. Okay, so you just have 3 names you have to keep track of for the men. And all the women are named Elizabeth or Margaret or Anne. Okay, so it's really not that hard. Now, by the time you get to the Richard III play, you have this character, Queen Margaret. This is Margaret of Anjou, who was married to Henry VI. But by the time you get to the Richard III play, she is a widow. And she recaps some of the things that happened earlier in the tetralogy, in the Henry VI plays. For example, she says, "I had an Edward till a Richard killed him. I had a Harry," now remember that's a nickname for Henry, "till a Richard killed him. Thou hadst an Edward till a Richard killed him. Thou hadst a Richard till a Richard killed him." See, they're all Richard or Henry or Edward. Okay, and this is my favorite line of Queen Margaret's. "Thy Edward he is dead that stabbed my Edward. Thy other Edward dead to quit my Edward." Got it? Okay, so it should all be pretty clear by now. Okay, so that's just a hint for reading the Henry VI plays. Now let's move on here, and here's one of the Richards that we're talking about, and this is Richard Plantagenet, and he is an important character in Henry VI plays, and somewhat related to the Jack Cade rebellion that we're going to talk about. Now, you may remember in Henry V, before Henry starts on his campaign to France, he finds out that there are 3 noblemen who are traitors, who have tried to sell him out to the French. Okay, and one of them is named Richard, Earl of Cambridge. See, we've already got 2 Richards in this part. So he's one of the 3 traitors, and he is executed. And that was the punishment for treason, which was the most serious crime that you could commit. And there was a principle that went along with treason, and that was called corruption of the blood. So it wasn't just that the traitor himself was punished, but his family was punished in the sense that they could not inherit his lands or titles. So Richard Plantagenet here, who is the son of Richard, Earl of Cambridge, and by the way, is the father of Richard III, so just another Richard there. He did not have a title inherited from his father, but Henry VI very graciously changed that and allowed him to have a title and get his lands back. He restored those, and Richard Plantagenet repaid Henry VI's kindness by claiming that he was actually the person with the best claim to the throne, rather than Henry VI. And I won't get into all the genealogy there, but let me just say, Richard Plantagenet, now the Duke of York, claimed that he was descended from Edmund Mortimer, who was a descendant of the 3rd son of Edward III, whereas Henry VI was descended from the 4th son of Edward III. And therefore, if you were descended from the 3rd son, you had a better claim than somebody who was descended from the 4th son, okay? And it's more complex than that, but that's enough for now. And so Plantagenet hires this guy, or persuades this guy named Jack Cade, who's from the county of Kent, to stage a rebellion against Henry VI. So let's take a look at the Jack Cade rebellion. Now, before it actually starts, before Jack makes his entrance, we have a couple of commoners, and they're talking about the situation for the common people in England at that time, and they're complaining, and one says, "Oh, miserable age, virtue is not regarded in handicraftsmen." And another one says, "The nobility think scorn to go in leather aprons." And nay, more, the king's council are no good workmen. So they really think that they're being held in low esteem and that the nobility are getting away with a lot of things. And then we have Jack Cade himself come upon the scene. And with Jack Cade is his sidekick, you might call him, who is a guy called Dick the Butcher. And when Jack Cade first opens his mouth, Dick the Butcher is making little asides, kind of undercutting what Jack Cade is saying. So Jack Cade starts out by saying, "My father was a Mortimer." So he's making the same claim that Richard Plantagenet, the Duke of York, is making, that he's descended from the 3rd son of Edward III, not the 4th son. And Dick says, he was an honest man and a good bricklayer. And Cade says, "My mother, a Plantagenet," part of a royal family. Dick says, "I knew her well, she was a midwife." And Cade says, "My wife descended of the Lacys." And Dick says, "She was indeed a peddler's daughter and sold many laces." So then Jack Cade, like a good politician, lays out his platform. "There shall be in England 7 halfpenny loaves sold for a penny. The 3-hooped pot shall have 10 hoops." He's basically saying that there will be 3 quarts in a quart measure. And I will make it felony to drink small beer. That's beer that has a very low alcohol content. And all the realm shall be in common. And in Cheapside shall my palfrey go to grass. And Cheapside, despite the name, was a prosperous commercial area. That's where he's going to graze his horse. And when I am king, as king I will be. And the people say, "God save your majesty." And so Jack Cade goes on to say, "I thank you, good people. There shall be no money. All shall eat and drink on my score, and I will apparel them all in one livery, that they may agree like brothers and worship me, their Lord." So it's a typical politician. He's going to promise you everything, except you're going to have to wear livery, meaning that you're his servant, and you're going to have to worship him. So then, Dick the Butcher says the famous line, "The first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers." Okay, so now you know what play it's from, and you know what character says it. And we'll talk about it some more a little later on. And Cade replies to that, "Nay, that I mean to do, is not this a lamentable thing, that of the skin of an innocent lamb should be made parchment? That parchment, being scribbled o'er, should undo a man. Some say the bee stings, but I say 'tis the bee's wax. For I did but seal once to a thing, and I was never mine own man since." How now? Who's there? Now, the how now who's there is because the person has been brought before him and by the rebels, and this is a character that's referred to as the clerk of Chatham. He's a law clerk. And so he is interrogated by Jack Cade and the rebels, and they found out a number of things about him that show that he is an absolutely despicable person who has no right to live. For example, he can write and read. He was caught teaching school children to read, obviously corrupting our youth. And he has a book with red letters in it, which means he's a conjurer. And he can make bonds and write informal legal script. Well, yeah, he's a law clerk. His name is Emmanuel, which translates God with us, and this is a word often used at the top of documents. And Dick the Butcher tells him it's going to go hard on him because of that. And he can write his own name. This is taken as a confession. And what do they do with him? Well, Jack Cade pronounces the punishment: hang him with his pen and inkhorn around his neck. So he is taken away and hanged. Now, I think to really understand what this scene is about, you need to understand a basic legal principle that is called benefit of clergy. Now, you may have heard this phrase, benefit of clergy, used in everyday language in modern parlance, and probably the way you heard it used is not what it actually meant back in those days. So whatever you thought it meant, forget about that. I'm going to explain what it actually is. Okay, so benefit of clergy is the privilege of clergymen to be tried for their crimes in the ecclesiastical courts, the church courts, rather than in the secular courts of the king. And this practice came about because of a dispute that arose between Henry II and Thomas Becket when Becket was Archbishop of Canterbury. And up till Henry II's time, in the courts there had always been a clergyman and a secular judge making the decision. And Henry II decided he was going to change that, and these were going to be the king's courts, and they were going to have a secular judge and no clergyman as a judge. And Becket said, well, all right, but if you're going to do that, clergymen cannot be tried in the king's court. They have to be tried in the ecclesiastical courts. And Henry II did not agree with that. They had a big argument about it. And for some reason, some of Henry's henchmen murdered Thomas Becket in the cathedral. And this actually was a very unpopular move. A lot of people were mad at Henry about that. And Henry had to relent and say that, okay, the clergyman would be tried in the ecclesiastical courts. Now, why would you want to be tried in the ecclesiastical court rather than the king's court? Well, there was a big difference in the punishments you could get. In the king's court, a lot of crimes were capital crimes, so you could be hanged if you were found guilty. In the ecclesiastical court, the sentence would be much lighter. You might have to say some Hail Marys or something like that. So really, there was no choice. I mean, you'd want to be in the ecclesiastical court. That was almost as good as being not guilty. Well, so how did you prove that you were a clergyman? Well, there was a literacy test. And you had to read Psalm 51 from the Latin Bible. That's the one that starts, "O God, have mercy upon me." And so if you could read that from the Latin Bible, then you proved you were a clergyman. And so really it got to be so that anybody who was literate and could read that Psalm 51 from the Latin Bible got benefit of clergy, even though they weren't actually a priest or a monk or something like that. And then it got so, well, illiterate people would memorize Psalm 51. And when they were asked to read it, they would hold the book and they would pretend to be reading it, but they were just reciting it from memory. And so that was a way that a lot of other people got away with murder, you might say, by getting into the ecclesiastical courts. Now, the Psalm 51 came to be called the neck verse because it could save your neck. And an interesting point about this that I think, this whole business about killing the person because he could read and write, it says something about society, because literacy was really the bridge between having power and not having power. And if you could read and write, that was probably an indicator that you were in the more powerful people in society. And of course, reading and writing meant you could get away with crimes that people who were illiterate could not get away with. And that's why when we get to this scene in the Cade Rebellion where the clerk of Chatham is executed for being literate, it really picks up on some of the resentment that the illiterate people would have towards those who they felt were tricking them and giving them a raw deal in society because they couldn't read. Now, King Henry VI finds out that there's this rebellion brewing, and he sends a small contingent of soldiers to quell the rebellion, led by Sir Humphrey Stafford and his brother William. Well, they greatly underestimated the rebellion, which was 5,000 people strong by this time, and the rebels ambushed them and killed both of the Stafford brothers. And the next thing we know in the play is that a messenger is running to Henry VI, and he says, "The rebels are in Southwark. Fly, my lord." Now, Southwark, that's in the greater London area already, and they're marching from Kent, which is in the southeast corner of England. And the messenger says, "Jack Cade proclaims himself Lord Mortimer and calls your grace usurper openly and vows to crown himself in Westminster. His army is a ragged multitude. Sir Humphrey Stafford and his brother's death have given them heart and courage to proceed. All scholars, lawyers, courtiers, gentlemen, they call false caterpillars," and that was a slang term for a person who preys on others, "and intend their death." Well, so this scares the bejesus out of Henry VI, and so he flees from London for a while. And Jack Cade is able to enter London with his 5,000 followers, and he says, "Now is Mortimer," and he's still calling himself Mortimer for his claim to the throne, "now is Mortimer lord of this city, and here, sitting upon London stone, I charge and command that of the city's cost, the pissing conduit run nothing but claret wine the first year of our reign." Okay, that's California wine, but anyway. "And now henceforward it shall be treason for any that calls me other than Lord Mortimer." And immediately after he says this, a soldier runs in calling for Jack Cade and is immediately killed at Cade's command because he didn't call him Lord Mortimer. Okay. And so Cade orders his men to set London Bridge on fire, this is according to Shakespeare, and to burn down the Tower of London, and to pull down the Savoy Palace and the Inns of Court. Inns of Court, of course, is where the lawyers were trained. And Dick the Butcher says to his master, "I have a suit unto your lordship, only that the laws of England may come out of your mouth." And Jack says, "I have thought upon it. It shall be so. Away, burn all the records of the realm. My mouth shall be the Parliament of England, and henceforward all things shall be in common." Now, of course, Shakespeare is painting a picture of a would-be tyrant here, but I think you have to admit he's got a lot in common with some of the kings that we see in Shakespeare's plays. Let's move on a little bit. Now, we have another person that's brought before him for judgment, and that is Lord Say, who was the king's treasurer. And Jack Cade says, "Fellow kings," and of course now everybody's a king according to him, but I think it's one of those situations where everybody's equal, but some people are going to be more equal than others. And he says, "I tell you that Lord Say hath gelded the commonwealth and made it a eunuch, and more than that, he can speak French, and therefore he is a traitor." And he goes on to say, "Thou hast most traitorously corrupted the youth of the realm in erecting a grammar school. Thou hast caused printing to be used, and thou hast built a paper mill. Thou hast men about thee that usually talk of a noun and a verb, and such abominable words as no Christian ear can endure to hear." And Lord Say says, these hands are free from guiltless bloodshedding, this breast from harboring foul, deceitful thoughts. Oh, let me live. And Cade says in an aside, I feel remorse in myself with his words, but I'll bridle it. He shall die, and it be but for pleading so well for his life. So he sends Lord Say off to be beheaded. They also behead Lord Say's son-in-law, and they put their heads on pikes, and they parade the heads through the town, and they make the two heads look like they're kissing each other. And Cade says, peers who don't pay him tribute will be executed. Women who marry must first yield their virginity to him. And men will only be able to possess land at his good graces. So what happens? Well, finally, Henry VI sends some competent noblemen to try to quell the rebellion, Buckingham and Clifford, and they say to the crowd, who loves the king and will embrace his pardon, fling up his cap and say, God save his majesty. Who hateth him and honors not his father, Henry V, that made all France to quake, shake he his weapon at us and pass by. And what does the crowd say? They say, God save the king, God save the king. So that's what the rebels are saying. And Jack Cade is not going to let this go by unchallenged. And he says, I thought you would never have given out these arms till you had your ancient freedom, but you were all recreants and dastards and delight to live in slavery to the nobility. And the crowd says, we'll follow Cade, we'll follow Cade. It may remind you of the crowd in Julius Caesar. They go one way, then they go another way. And so what does Clifford say? Well, he says, is Cade the son of Henry V, that thus you do exclaim you'll go with him? Will he conduct you through the heart of France and make the meanest of you earls and dukes? Well, I don't think Henry VI was about to make the meanest of them earls and dukes either. But nevertheless, the crowd buys his rhetoric and says, a Clifford, we'll follow the king and Clifford. And so by this time, Jack Cade has figured out which way the wind is blowing. And he says, was ever feather so lightly blown to and fro as this multitude? The name of Henry V hails them to 100 mischiefs and makes them leave me desolate. My sword, make way for me, for here is no staying. And so Jack Cade flees, and basically the rebellion disappears. It just dissolves after that. And all the people who had followed Cade are pardoned in the name of Henry V. And so Cade he's fleeing, he's hiding in forests and things like that. He goes for several days without any food, and then he is caught stealing from the garden of a man named Alexander Iden. And it's actually ironic, if he hadn't stolen the food, he could have asked Iden for the food, and Iden probably would have just given it to him. But because he tries to steal it and he gets caught, he fights with Iden. Iden finds out he's Jack Cade. Iden kills him. And as Cade is dying, he says, Iden, farewell, and be proud of thy victory. Tell Kent from me, that's the county of Kent that he came from. She hath lost her best man, and exhort all the world to be cowards, for I, that never feared any, am vanquished by famine, not by valor. So, that's Shakespeare's version of the Cade Rebellion. Let's look at a few historical facts that might be a little bit different. So I call this section A Little Revolting History. And I'm actually going to go back 69 years before the Cade Rebellion and look at the Peasants' Revolt, also called the Wat Tyler Rebellion of 1381. Now, this happened during the reign of Richard II. Richard II was 14 years old at the time. And this was a revolt against lawyers and the legal slavery or serfdom that the peasants endured. And the rebellion started in the county of Kent, which is in the southeast corner of England, just like the Jack Cade Rebellion did. And they marched to London, killing any lawyers they could find along the way. And they killed the Chief Justice of England, Sir John Cavendish. And they destroyed every attorney's house in the line of march between Kent and London. They camped in the Smithfield district of London. They seized the Tower of London. They destroyed the Savoy Palace, and eventually Wat Tyler was killed and the rebels dispersed, and that was the end of that rebellion. Okay, so we move ahead 69 years to the Jack Cade Rebellion, 1450, in the reign of Henry VI. And This rebellion demanded the abatement of taxes and dismissal of corrupt public officials. In the Jack Cade rebellion, there was actually no specific animus against lawyers. So that line, kill all the lawyers, that's not the mantra of the Jack Cade rebellion. It's really from the Wat-Tyler rebellion. And the Jack Cade rebellion murdered the Bishop of Salisbury, beheaded Lord Say, as I mentioned earlier, and they were defeated at the Battle of London Bridge in July 1450. Now, when the rebels first came into London, a lot of Londoners sympathized with them, but when the rebels started looting, the Londoners turned against them. And so when it came to the battle, the Londoners went against the rebels. And as I mentioned, Jack Cade was captured and killed. So those are some historical facts that are a little bit different from what Shakespeare said. And as far as destroying the Savoy Palace and the Inns of Court, which Jack Cade in the play tells his followers to do, these are things that actually happened in the Wat-Tyler Rebellion, not the Jack Cade Rebellion. Okay, so now that we have all that, let's get to the real question. What did Shakespeare mean when he said, kill all the lawyers? Well, I'm going to give you 5 possible interpretations of that line, and we can try to figure out what's right. Okay, so let's just start by considering face value. Maybe it really means what it says. Lawyers are oppressors and they should be killed. And there's actually, I think, some support in the play for that idea. And I want to start with what I think is actually one of the most poignant passages in this play, and it's the thing that Jack Cade says right after Dick the Butcher says, kill all the lawyers. Cade says, is not this a lamentable thing, that of the skin of an innocent lamb should be made parchment? That parchment, being scribbled o'er, should undo a man. Some say the bee stings, but I say 'tis the bee's wax. For I did but seal once to a thing, and I was never mine own man since. And that kind of tugs at me as a lawyer. Because I think what he's dealing with here, this is how an illiterate person or maybe a not highly educated person might feel about this mysterious thing that happens in the law when you have a piece of paper and some ink is put on it and maybe even some wax on it to seal it, and somehow it changes somebody's life. And I know that I've had situations where I clerked for judges and I had to sign off on certain things, advising the judge what I thought about how this case should be handled. And this is a big thing because you know that what you say and what you sign off to may have a big effect on somebody's life. It may have to do with keeping them in prison longer, or it may have to do with their losing money to somebody else. So this is difficult to understand. You can try to imagine what it would be like to be illiterate and you signed or sealed to something, and later on you realize there are implications that you never foresaw when you signed it. And you might very well feel that you were tricked. And that is why there's all the resentment about literacy that comes out in this rebellion. And also, when he's questioning Lord Say, he says, thou hast appointed justices of peace to call poor men before them about matters they were not able to answer. Moreover, thou hast put them in prison, and because they could not read, thou hast hanged them. When indeed only for that cause they have been most worthy to live. So again, there's this big resentment about literacy versus illiteracy, and this feeling that lawyers are people who are using this gift for literacy or this ability to read against people who can't read. So I think there is a case to be made that this is literal, that these people really meant it, and that there was a reason for it, and Shakespeare's not entirely unsympathetic to their reasons for wanting to kill all the lawyers. Now let's look at a completely contrary interpretation of this, and that is the idea that lawyers are defenders of liberty and that the anarchist rebels hate them because the rebels are trying to destroy society. Okay, so in context, that is a plausible interpretation, and this interpretation has been championed by our fellow Oxfordian, Justice John Paul Stevens. And he wrote a dissenting opinion in a case called Walters versus National Association of Radiation Survivors, 1985, in which he said, I reject the majority's apparent unawareness of the function of the independent lawyer as a guardian of our freedom. That function was, however, well understood by Jack Cade and his followers. Dick the Butcher's statement, the first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers, was spoken by a rebel, not a friend of liberty. As a careful reading of that text will reveal, Shakespeare insightfully realized that disposing of lawyers is a step in the direction of a totalitarian form of government. In my view, the citizen's right to consult an independent lawyer and to retain that lawyer to speak on his or her behalf is an aspect of liberty that is priceless. Thank you, Justice Stevens. And he's not the only lawyer to say this. Here's Howard Spiva, a trial attorney in Savannah, and on his website he says, my translation of Shakespeare's quote is, if you want tyrants to rule, first kill all the lawyers. I am proud to be an attorney. Thank you, Mr. Spiva. And another way to look at this is, well, maybe you don't like lawyers, maybe you're annoyed by lawyers, but hey, you could say, kill all the lawyers except mine when I need one. Right? When you need one, you need one. You don't want to kill all the lawyers. At least leave one for you. Okay, so we have two interpretations so far. And another interpretation, I noticed that as soon as I brought up the line, people laughed. And maybe it's just a laugh line. I mean, Shakespeare's got lots of comic relief in his plays. So maybe he just put it in there because it was going to get a good laugh. And not only does it get a good laugh from audiences, but it's the kind of joke that spawns other jokes. Here's one from Robin Williams. Shakespeare said, kill all the lawyers. There were no agents then. Okay, and let's go on to a fourth interpretation. And this is from an attorney named Gerald Bennett. And he says, well, maybe it's not really for lawyers or against them. Here's what he says. Here's a quote from him. He says, Shakespeare intended neither to praise nor to condemn lawyers. He intended to reproduce for his audience a historically documented rebellion. And he conflated historical accounts of Tyler's and Cade's rebellions for dramatic effect. So really, you could say, well, Shakespeare didn't really care one way or the other. He just did this because it's exciting and it makes for a conflict. And he put these aspects of the Wat Tyler Rebellion into his fictional portrayal of the Cade Rebellion, just so he could stir up more interest and more emotions from his audience and more laughter. So I think that's also a reasonable interpretation. And then maybe it's a condemnation of the misuse of law. And this is Daniel Kornstein's interpretation of it, one of his interpretations of kill all the lawyers. And he relates this to a character in Henry VI, Part 2 that I haven't mentioned before, and that is Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. So let me just give you a little background on him. He was a brother of Henry V, and so he was an uncle of Henry VI, and he was Lord Protector when Henry VI was a child. And he's called a virtuous prince in the play. He's loved by the people for his fairness, his even-handedness, and he represents the faithful adherence to the law. He says, I cannot justify whom the law condemns. And he is murdered by his political enemies who falsely accuse him of treason. And when this happens, the commoners rise up and demand the death of the Earl of Suffolk, whom they believe murdered Humphrey. And they say that Humphrey was 20 times the worth of Suffolk. And as Kornstein points out, this happens just before the Cade Rebellion. So maybe what's happening here is that the people have become disillusioned with the law because it's been misused, because it's become corrupt. And this person who would even-handedly administer the law has been foully murdered. So now they don't feel they can trust the law, they can't trust lawyers. And that is also a valid interpretation. So I've given you 5 possible interpretations. That it's to be taken at face value, lawyers are oppressors, that lawyers are defenders of liberty against anarchy, that it's just a joke, that it's for comic relief, that it neither praises nor condemns lawyers, that Shakespeare just wanted to have a lot of dramatic conflict in the situation, and that it's a condemnation of the misuse of law. So, what do you think? All of them, very good. It's all of the above. Hey, this is Shakespeare. There's never one meaning for anything. In Shakespeare, it resonates in so many ways. You can find so many different interpretations of them. And I think all of these interpretations have some validity to them, and you can't really discard any of them. And that's why we love Shakespeare. That's why it's so much fun to read him and to talk about him and discuss him and think about all the possible meanings that there are in his works. And I thank you for your attention. Thank you. Question, Michael.